I want to talk today a little bit about Lutheran identity. I hear a lot of people discussing this, and even if they're not using that phrase, Lutheran identity, it's really what they're getting at. There's a hot topic, it seems like, in the church these days, at least in my part of the church, about what exactly you need to do to preserve Lutheran identity. What are the essential things of Lutheran identity? How do we make sure that we can keep this Lutheran identity vibrant and alive and moving forward? And so you get a lot of discussions going on about the key things, the things that are essential, the things that make a Lutheran identity a Lutheran identity. What I observe is that often this Lutheran identity kind of boils down to the things that we associate with Lutheranism from our own experience. And this is standard across all people, in all places, in every kind of environment, every kind of tradition. We always identify the things that matter most to us with the things that relate to our upbringing, the things that we value, the things that we treasure. And so we create our own ideas about what it means to be Lutheran based on what we grew up with. So I have in my vision of what a Lutheran looks like. You probably have yours, and others have others based on what they grew up with. And so we associate a Lutheran identity with the things that feel right to us, that are familiar, that are comfortable, and so therefore comforting. Whether that's low church or high church, or whether it's a kind of small little intimate gathering or a very Germanic, whatever it is, we associate these things with what we are familiar with and what feel right to us, and so that becomes the right identity, the right kind of Lutheranism. Now, obviously that's a problem already because it's becoming very idiosyncratic and we're just kind of forcing our own familiar, comfortable things onto it. So this leads to interesting discussion though about what is the Lutheran things that are essential. Well, there are a few things I know are not essential parts of a Lutheran identity. And so one of the first things that is certainly not an essential part of a Lutheran identity is whether or not you are conservative or progressive. People will assume that, well, you obviously have to be conservative if you're Lutheran. That's not the case. Lutheranism does not demand a certain sort of political stance beyond following the leader who's there and speaking God's truth to that leader. There are lots of ways of going about this. So there's not a Lutheran identity which is peculiarly conservative or progressive that is Democratic or Republican. That's not part of our Lutheran identity. Styles of worship are also not part of our Lutheran identity. People would like to make it that. Well, liturgical worship, that's what is part of our Lutheran identity. Lots of room, but it's got to be liturgical. This is not part of our Lutheran identity. Our identity is not dependent upon the way that we worship. Now, those things are important because how you worship shapes how you think and operate. I get that. But it's not part of our core Lutheran identity. Another part of our Lutheran identity is not tied to academic rigor or doctrinal excellence. Yes, we have a history of this in our church body. We like doctrine. We like academic rigor. We care about this. But Lutheran identity is not tied to the way that we train our pastors. It's not tied to the way that we train our young people. It's not tied to knowing Greek or Latin or Hebrew or German. It's not tied to academic rigor. Lutheran identity has nothing to do with Master of Divinity over against some other kind of a degree or the kind of way into the office of the ministry. That's not what's going to preserve a Lutheran identity. And finally, of course, Lutheran identity is not part of a Germanic heritage or Scandinavian heritage or any part of European heritage or anything else for that matter, even though Luther was obviously a German and we have that kind of history coming through those parts of the European world. But that's not core to our Lutheran identity. So, what is core to our Lutheran identity? Well, I'll get there. Maybe. You see, this whole discussion about identity is really kind of strange. And this sort of obsession with identity is really a very peculiarly modern way of operating. And we don't recognize this, but I think this is important to back up and recognize this. We live in a world today, this very Western world in which we all operate in my Lutheran world, that is definitely driven by modernity. And that has created a sort of what we call a nihilistic way of operating, where people aren't sure what is really certainly true anymore, and everybody's out looking for their own truth. And even people like us, who are confident of God's truth and believe that there are foundations and things that are universally true, find ourselves having to create space for our own position and argue for our position. Nobody just takes it for granted anymore. And not even people in the church are free to just take it for granted. We are forced to have to make a case for where we're coming from. Now, part of that then ties into this whole identity, what makes us who we are. And this happens on an individual level and on a group level. Individuals in our contemporary world are compelled to figure out who they are. You have this burden of trying to determine who you are, create your space for who you are, create your own image, craft it. And we see people doing this online, we see people doing this in real life. They're always worried about how they operate, the image they portray, who they are. And it's not just something they can accept as a given, they have to figure it out. Well, this burden of choosing and making my identity is not an easy thing. And this translates into groups and whole people groups who also start to feel like they have to establish their identity and carve out a niche and give them kind of peculiar, this is who we are. Churches do the same thing. And this is exactly what's going on with all this obsession with Lutheran identity. Who are we? What makes us who we are? Why do we care so much about this? We care because we live in a culture that kind of demands it. We feel like we've got to create our space over against everybody else's space. And so when churches start to act like identity matters, they are acting very modernist and very much in a nihilistic way, trying to establish their identity as a good one and trying to create space for it. So whenever we are trying to determine or establish or create or maintain an identity, we're really betraying the fact that we're operating in a very modernistic way. It's a bad idea. We don't have to be so obsessed with maintaining our identity. We don't have to fight for or discuss what is the Lutheran identity. These things shouldn't concern us. This is not a big issue. It's not our job to preserve or protect a certain way of being Christian, a Lutheran way of being. We don't have to do that. And it's not our job even to preserve or protect or maintain the Christian confession. That's not our job. God never tells us to preserve or protect or hang on. He tells us to follow Christ. He tells us to proclaim Christ. And it's God who preserves and protects and takes care of things. One of my favorite Old Testament stories is when Elijah goes off to Mount Horeb because he's had it. He's tired of being God's prophet. He's scared. He's running from Ahab and Jezebel. And he hangs out underneath a broom tree. And then God says, "What are you doing here?" And we have the nice back and forth where God gets Elijah back up, gives him something to do, and sends him off. But the cool thing in that whole story is where he tells Elijah, and this is 1 Kings 19, in verse 18, he says, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal." And so Elijah thinks he's the only one left. God says, no, there's 7,000. Now, the cool thing about this verse, though, is that who preserved those 7,000? God did. God preserved them. I will leave. I put them there. God's the one who takes care of his church. He has promised to do that. It's not our job to have to preserve or protect or to hang on. Because when we start to operate this way, it so quickly collapses into a circle the wagons, shelter in place, hunker down, preserve and protect kind of attitude. This is not good. And then this so quickly collapses into a repristinationist attitude where, oh, this is the right time. The one I grew up with, that's the version we need. Or the one that Walter had, that's the version of Lutheranism we need. We've got to hang on to that or get that back or keep it. It's a repristinationist model. God never calls us to circle the wagons, hunker down, shelter in place, or try to preserve a certain thing. We don't have to preserve anything. It's not our job. Our job is to follow Christ and proclaim Christ. That's what we do. And that brings me to my other verse for today, which is from 1 Peter. Awesome verse, we all know it. 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter writes that you are a chosen race, royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Notice the driving thing in all these verbs. God elects. God chooses. We belong to him. For what purpose? Not to preserve and protect or establish, but to proclaim the virtues of the one who called us. That's what we're here to do. So, Lutheran identity, I'm not too interested in it, frankly. I'm not too wrapped up in it. I'm not too concerned about it. I don't think you need to be that wrapped up in it. What you should be wrapped up in is knowing Christ and following Christ. And those things you receive in your baptism, in the gifts of the Lord's Supper, in the gifts of the preaching. You receive what God gives you. He tells you who you are. You belong to Him. He puts you in relationships. You know who you are. And He puts you in a church body. Yes, we have our traditions and the things we love and the things we enjoy and our peculiar parts that we have in our corner of Christendom. Yes, we enjoy all those things and we cultivate those. That's fine. But we don't need to do it in a sort of a fearful way. The fearful thing is such a wrong way of operating. What makes us Lutheran is not a heritage or a way of worship or a way of educating or a way of making who we are in our conservatism. That's not what makes us Lutheran. What makes us Lutheran is that we hear what Jesus tells us, we follow Him, and we are normed by what the Bible teaches, and we are normed by our confessions. The confessions tell us who we are, tell us who God is, tell us what it means to follow Him, help us to do that rightly. So what we should be focusing on is the Bible where God speaks to us and the confessions where we confess what this means and then we live according to that. How that plays out, man, there is a lot of latitude. And we don't need to be so worried about being narrow about certain little things, but we need to be focusing on the things that do matter. This counts, guys. I'm invested in this. I've got 11 grandkids, all under 12, who I am raising to be faithful followers of Christ and to love and to cherish their Lutheran heritage. Does that mean I'm teaching them to circle the wagons? No. Does that mean I'm trying to instill in them all that it means to follow Christ? Absolutely. And to love their Lutheran heritage and the teaching the Book of Concord? Absolutely. That's what I'm focused on. There are so many ways of doing that, so many ways of cultivating this love in them. I'm invested in this for the long haul, guys. I care about every one of my grandkids. I want them growing up cherishing their heritage in Christ, knowing who they are in Christ. And that's what I'm all about. So don't get the idea that it doesn't matter, it's a free-for-all. No, I care very much about this gift given to me in my Lutheran understanding of who I am, but it's the understanding of following Christ according to God's truth. I don't have to preserve that or protect it. I just have to make sure I'm faithful in my day in living this way and proclaiming this and then making sure that the next generation hears it and lives it as well. That's what it's all about. Lutheran identity? No. Christian identity? That's not such a big deal either because I know my identity is what's given to me. I don't have to preserve it or protect it or fight for it. I simply receive what God gives and live in that reality. That's the identity I have. That's the identity we should be treasuring and celebrating.